Undertale was a game pivotal in teaching me so many lessons in empathy and changing how I view characters within a video game's narrative and in the world in which they inhabit. And being such an impactful game, it was all the more shocking and even more exciting that a survey program from the creator of Undertale, Toby Fox, would randomly drop in 2018. But little did I know that this demo was building towards something massive. And that game became what we know today as Deltarune. And in my opinion, Deltarune is on track to becoming one of the greatest narratives to grace the medium of gaming. So let me tell you how I went from experiencing Deltarune Chapters 1 through 4 over the years how it came out and break down all the narrative themes that seem to be culminating to one of the greatest gaming stories ever told. As previously stated, in October of 2018, the survey program would drop, and this would later become Deltarune Chapter 1. And in this period of my life, I was just starting to get back into gaming. I had taken some time to kind of focus on my senior year of high school, graduate, move on to college. I mean, video games were still there, but I didn't start finding my love for them again like I did with my Xbox 360 or Nintendo Wii days until I saw this demo drop. So I booted this game into what I thought was going to be the next Undertale. But, okay, so the game is just like absolutely nothing like Undertale, except in art style and the reused characters and the overall gameplay, and a lot of the dialogue is very similar to anything Toby Fox might do, but totally different otherwise. But in all seriousness, I can understand why people think that this game is a sequel or direct successor to Undertale. But it is truly a massive departure from the original game, both in quality design and overall story structure. And speaking of plot, one of the major core narrative pillars of Deltarune is made abundantly clear right from the start, that in this game, your choices do not matter. And of course, we would come to learn that technically they do matter, but it's not as abundantly clear in Chapter 1, but more on that later. As you begin the chapter, you're met with plenty of familiar faces that you've seen before, almost as if you know this place but you can't quite put your finger on it. You are also introduced to a whole new cast of characters like Birdley and Noelle, and of course the most important newcomer, Jockington. I mean, look at this dude. He's peak game design, man. He's just the best. However, since Jockington isn't as instrumental to the plot yet, I should talk about this lovely dino, Susie. And it's pretty obvious from frame 1 that Susie is set up to be the troubled child of the story, but we'll explore more of that as the chapter goes on. So Barney over here wants a snack that only sticks of chalk can satisfy, and we're tasked with going into the school supply closet. And this is where the fun begins, because we start to see the depth and lore Undertale really has to offer here. I mean, we're introduced to the Dark World and generally how they work. We're also introduced to the lore and the great prophecy of this world. We also come to find out that we, the character, and our friends like Susie are called Lightners. Yeah, am I saying that right? Lightner? Yeah, real creative, Toby. And the characters that inhabit this world are called Darkners. Again, real creative. And basically right from the jump, we learn most of the lore and the backstory of this world from this fluffy yet familiar looking character, Ralsei. Ralsei tells us about the prophecy foretold in the 3 heroes that are meant to steal the Dark Fountain. But most importantly, right after we meet Ralsei, we meet Lancer. Look at this little freak. I mean, he's just so round and stupid, and I don't think he has any thoughts behind his head. I mean, look at this guy. He's handsome as hell. But as I was saying, you see yourself progress through this world and all the different puzzles and encounters and enemies that it has and all the different battles, which this battling system is actually more akin to a Final Fantasy / like JRPG battle style, but it still has the bullet dodging health mechanics that are found in Undertale. It's really good. I actually prefer it more than Undertale's battle system. Along the way, we see Susie begrudgingly become our friend, and then the bad guy, and then our friend again. And what's really interesting though is despite Ralsei heavily encouraging us to spare people, you can choose to fight or not fight enemies in this game. And if you choose to not fight, we actually recruit the enemies to your little town after the fact. And that seems to be a main point of contention in this chapter, but in the end, it ultimately doesn't matter. Just like Clifford the big purple dino over here is seen actively beating up many NPCs along the way, while you and Ralsei are actively chasing her and trying to stop her. Finally, in this chase with Lancer and Susie and Starwalker and all the other crew, we end up at the castle where we watch the main conflict of this chapter play out between Susie and Lancer. And this brings up our second narrative pillar within this chapter and also throughout all of Deltarune, where we talk about people finding their true selves and opening up to others. This scene plays out both in in the basement between Susie and Lancer, and then later on the rooftop when you're fighting the king, which finally results in Grimace over here saving the day and opening up to the gang. So we go on to beat the king and save the town, and oh my god, is that a femboy? But in all of seriousness, Ralsei taking this cloak off and revealing more of themselves is just further driving home the point of the second narrative pillar in this chapter of people finding their true selves. And even better, you get to see everyone in Hometown once you leave the Dark World. It gives you this sense of agency to just explore, and it just feels amazing. But something I will never forgive that little dog for is this cliffhanger of an ending. Like, what do you mean we had to live with this for 3 whole years until chapter 2? The entire community was just blown away for years, and there was so much theory crafting and people talking about different things and fiending for more of the game. Unfortunately though, there are plenty of critics of this game in 2018, and plenty of the criticism was just comparing the game directly to Undertale. But that's like comparing the first tutorial area of Breath of the Wild against the entirety of the game of Tears of the Kingdom. Or in different terms, it's like comparing the demo of Undertale to the entirety of Earthbound. But I do think that this chapter, as we will go on to find out, is probably the weakest of all 4 chapters that are out currently. But what it does most importantly is set up the important narrative themes that we will see throughout the rest of the story of Deltarune. I would argue that there's actually 3 narrative pillars that we have seen thus far. The first being the commentary on the illusion of choice. Basically, all your choices don't matter, you can't really change the agency or the way the game goes, a lot of the characters are going to make their own choice, all that good stuff, right? And the second narrative pillar being about finding one's true self. And this is seen in the story of all of the people in the Fun Gang being established. I mean, we have Dino Grimace over here softening up and opening up to the group. We even see Lancer kind of coming to their own agency. And we also see Ralsei open up at the end of the story to the gang, and by no longer hiding in the shadows. I mean, and even Chris opens up at the end of the game. And finally, there is a third narrative pillar I would like to talk about, but I feel it would be better expounded upon if I talk about it in my recount of chapter 2. So the wait for chapter 2 was absolutely excruciating. I mean, it was a long 3 years. But chapter 2 of Deltarune thankfully came at a time where most people, including myself, needed it the most, where the world felt like a very dark and lonely place because of the pandemic. However, while chapter 1 set expectations for the series, this chapter absolutely blew those expectations out of the water and just genuinely changed my brain chemistry. This chapter would start out fairly normal despite the insane ending from chapter 1. You go to school, you experience some light Yuri, and then you end up at the computer lab, which, big surprise, is the next location for our Dark World. And in this one, you meet some of the most colorful characters in the series to date, with the first one being Queen. And in this introduction, we are introduced to the idea that characters from the overworld can play a pivotal role in the story. And this becomes especially apparent when Queen sets herself up to be the main antagonist by capturing Grape Dino's soon-to-be GF, Noelle. This is followed by a valid crash out and then a cool-ass intro into this world. There are plenty of small and cute references and wonderful new characters throughout the start of this chapter. Like, I love the 3 bots and the Charlie Brown-esque fight that you have with them, and the Hacker Man that looks like a big mouse, and my personal favorite character from this entire chapter, which is Newbert. I mean, look at this dude. He blows Jockington out of the water. But as cool as Newbert is, we progress the story further and learn that Birdly is also part of this Dark World and is angling himself to actually work with the Queen despite her protest. You heard that right, she doesn't want his help, and it's quite hilarious. The more you progress this chapter, those main pillars start to re-reveal themselves, showing that they're going to be a mainstay of this entire series. The first narrative pillar becoming apparent, you're asked if you want to go with the Purple Pikmin Dino or Ralsei, and no matter what you choose, you're actually left alone at the spot, and you move on and find Noelle eventually. And speaking of Noelle, she is probably the best example of the second narrative pillar, where you partner up with her and you slowly get to learn more about Noelle and her true self and the past that Chris and her have had. Noelle in this chapter seems to be the star that drives the narrative forward, between Queen's desire to capture her and her revealing to us the history that she has with her sister December, and how maybe Chris played a role in her disappearance. Of course, more of these details are going to reveal themselves in later chapters, so let's progress to my actual favorite encounter of this entire Deltarune series. This is a little bit of a basic choice, but he's literally on my microphone. I love Spamton G. Spamton. Not because he looks like the funny small little email man, but actually because he represents the third and technically optional narrative pillar of Deltarune, which is of course freedom and escapism. Now I know that you could argue that illusion of choice and freedom and escapism are two sides of the same coin, but in Deltarune's approach, it makes them their two own distinct narrative pillars, and it'll make more sense as I explain why Spamton is so great. As I said before, Spamton is the physical representation of a literal spam email, but more importantly, the backstory and the context that we get throughout the rest of the chapter that we learn he was once an Addison, and one day he received a phone call from a mysterious man providing him knowledge on how to become a big shot. It's clear that he achieved this fame through the old poster that we see behind the dumpster that we first encounter him at, but something has happened between then and now that has made him fall short of his once glory days. Spamton's ambitions for freedom and the promised freedom by the voice on the phone is what makes him such an interesting character. A promise of freedom through breaking away from things that are viewed that are tying you down. Now this is not the first time that we've seen this narrative pillar come up. I actually skipped talking about the secret boss of chapter 1, Jevil, who introduces the concept of this narrative pillar of freedom, but in a more chaotic and nihilistic perspective, more in the nothing matters therefore I'm free kind of way. Of course at the time I didn't know this would become a narrative pillar of the series, but it is abundantly clear throughout your interactions in chapter 2 with Spamton and seeking out the different quests that he puts you on, that as you progress through the chapter, the concept of freedom and breaking free is what Spamton is more representative of, versus Jevil, who represents more of the nihilistic chaos freedom. And it's even more apparent that these two are connected in some way and through the concept of freedom through this motif that they have in both of their main songs, which of course is dubbed the freedom motif. The way Spamton introduces how you proceed down his plotline is done so well, especially because Chapter 1's secret boss is a little bit easily missable. It also just feels like he kind of ties in well with everybody in the world of this chapter while still having his own creepy vibe, you know? This chapter continues to give us more examples of opening up and finding one's true self with the Burley scene and how it became known that he became the know-it-all kind of guy because he was the one at the spelling bee that won, and he won through a fluke because Noelle had a traumatizing moment. And later, towards the end of the chapter, Ralsei opens up about the roaring and how the queen's ambitions at the start were completely misguided. But the prime and most adorable example comes when you see Noelle and Susie open up to each other during the Ferris wheel ride. I mean, this adds so many layers to our main cast of characters, and this scene also taps a little bit into the illusion of choice as well. By removing the player and Chris out of the scene, and it creates this amazing force of autonomy by laser focusing in on Susie, kind of almost foreshadowing that she has more control over the narrative than we do as the player. And as this chapter closed with the Battle of the Queen and being saved by the darkness of the world and everything I had said already previously, the explanation of the roaring sets us up for the overarching narrative of Deltarune and the mysterious disappearance of Noelle's sister, December, and why we're trying to figure out how and if they're connected to all these dark worlds. And on top of that, there is someone who is creating the Dark Fountains to begin with, and we don't know what their exact goal seems to be, but it seems to be related around the Dark Fountains and maybe bringing about in the roaring. And you probably come up with 100 theories as to who might be the one creating all the Dark Fountains, until you see the end of chapter 2. Am I? Did I just watch that correctly? Did Chris just create a Dark Fountain? Toby, when I catch you! Tony! When I get you! But as you can see, this chapter set the bar so much higher for the Deltarune series as a whole. And this cliffhanger left a community in a frenzy. I mean, I was obsessed with Deltarune back in 2021, and I was deep into the fan theories about the disappearance of December, who the actual Roaring Knight might be. Is Chris the one making all the different Dark Fountains, or was this one just a fluke? I mean, we had truly entered a golden age of community fan theories, and the sauce was so deep and palpable. You saw amazing theories like Chris is the Knight, and Chris is evil, and all those different types of things, and Chris versus the player. You also saw theories around Friend and Spamton and what that all meant. And honestly, thank God we had this content to meter out Deltarune and our obsession with it, because chapter 3 and 4 would not come for another 4 fucking years. Thankfully, after that time, we would get 2 chapters at once, but now I've waited a total of 7 years since the beginning of this survey program. But with that being said, just when Deltarune started to kind of fade out of our minds and the dust had settled in the theory community, on April 2nd during the Switch to Nintendo Direct, we would see this trailer. Chapter 3 is weird, and from the very start of this chapter, everything just feels really far off. Like this uncomfortable conversation between Susie and Ralsei, where they finally explain what exactly the Darkners are. Darkners are actually items in the Lightner world, and when they are in the dark, the distortion of the darkness makes them real or gives them personality. But in the perspective of the Lightners, they look nothing more than like a playing card on the ground. This is an incredible moment of transparency from Ralsei, and it really plays on our second narrative pillar of people being more transparent and true to themselves. But it also makes us ask, what are their real goals, and also why do they know so much? And lastly, why are they withholding so much information from us to begin with? But just as all of these questions cross your mind and also Susie's mind in this scenario, you'd be interrupted in the coolest way possible, finally becoming part of Mr. Antenna's TV time. Okay, I promise I won't sing on the channel ever again. So Tenna had a ton of speculation built around themselves back in 2021, especially after the ending of Chapter 2 when we see the smile on the television. We knew that the television was going to play a prominent role within the series, but some people also thought that this smile might have maybe been Friend, and also there was a ton of theories about, Spamton and Tenna, and there's all these other theories that his name was actually going to be Mike, but it turns out Mike was actually just a group of these cat people that were trying to kind of substitute for the previous stagehand that was actually named Mike. But that's a theory for a later day. And if you want to see me do a community theory summary from all the different chapters of Deltarune, go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe, and maybe at 5K subs, we'll make that video. However, despite the community's best efforts to predict what Tenna would look like, and thankfully they got it all wrong, Tony gives his character so much personality and life just from frame 1. I love the way that Tenna is this rotoscope monstrosity, but also is really charming in the same instance instead of that 2D sprite work. And after this amazing introduction, the pace for the chapter is set, with each round of the game shows being akin to a Zelda-type dungeon, followed by some quiz show stuff and maybe some battles along the way, which, oh my god, let me tell you about the battle music. And despite all of this amazing music and fun, the vibe of everything still actually feels just a little bit off, And that feeling never fades throughout basically the entire chapter. And the TV show prop design of this chapter just feels like a really on-the-nose allegory for the entire situation. One cooking show, a heartbreak later, and some throuple action combined with a concert. That sounds about right. Which, by the way, the concert has, insane lore implications. It is finally revealed to us that Tenna is colluding with the Roaring Knight. And we discover this because we find Toriel captured in a ball capsule in this kind of wintry room over in the corner of the stage. One amazing chase scene later where you free Tenna's staff and minions, you are finally met with the big confrontation with Tenna himself and are introduced to some amazing music and even better battle mechanics. But let's get back to some of those narrative pillars, because after the fight, there's actually this really strange dialogue exchange between Ralsei and Tenna, where Ralsei essentially tells Tenna that he doesn't matter, and Darkners don't matter in the terms of Lightners. And in an amazing moment, Susie delivers a dialogue that really just exemplifies all 3 narrative pillars that make up this game. And this is done by saying Tenna does have a purpose, and if they feel like they don't, that they need to define their own purpose in this life. There is no destiny for anybody, and it is their job to break away from any kind of destiny that they have predetermined for themselves or somebody else has predetermined for them. Basically saying you define your own purpose and your choices matter, which directly contradicts the first narrative pillar of this game, that your choices don't matter. And not only does it contradict this entity in the game that tells you that at the very beginning, but it also contradicts the exact thing Ralsei just said, creating this weird divide between them for the rest of the chapter, and this would all lay the groundwork for something that would become far more prominent in Chapter 4. But more on that later. So after the Purple Dino Nugget monologues, Tenna gives us back Toriel, and we are met with a fun and awesome moment where everything is good and everything is... So I'm sure, like many of you, this Roaring Night moment actually broke my brain. I didn't think we were gonna see this guy until like the end of the game, and here we are, not even halfway through the game, and the big bad that has been alluded to us is here. All the shock and horror aside, Tony does a fantastic job of making this fight feel menacing, and like all of the stakes in the world are on top of it, even though at the end of the day it ends up being this scripted sequence. And it's on top of all this shock and awe that they make the night feel like this high stakes battle that is almost impossible to beat. Unless you acquire the Shadow Mantle. In short, you get the Shadow Mantle by doing some weird backstage game that Ram refers you to. And on top of that, Ram refers to how Chris loves to play games where they have the most amount of freedom. And of course, all these backroom secrets lead to the kind of sort of secret boss of this chapter called E-Ram. And after completing all of those really weird levels and defeating E-Ram, you get the Shadow Mantle and some really weird dialogue between Susie and Chris. But back to the Roaring Night, where the Roaring Night kind of still plays on that first narrative pillar that your choices don't matter, because even if you beat the Roaring Night, the same sequence basically still plays out, except you get this small little shadow crystal instead. And Toriel ends up having bad dreams instead of sweet dreams, so she's upset that you beat the night, and that's kind of interesting. And after you defeat the night and then the night defeats you, you have Undying coming in to swoop in and trying to save the day, just to get captured and taken off to the bunker in this town. You know, the place that we thought that the entire end of the game was going to take place in, but, you know, I digress. Who knows at this point? After Susie bangs on the door a ton and then walks away, we learn that we need a code to get inside of the bunker. And then we see Chris do this. So there's a lot to comment on about this chapter and the community impacts of Tenna and all the different memes and all the yaoi between Tenna and Spamton, and, you know, Toriel being asleep and the expression on her face changing when you beat the Roaring Night, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But for me to properly articulate just how the community feels at the moment, we have to talk about Chapter 4 as well, because Chapter 3 and 4 both dropped in tandem. The start of Chapter 4 feels like you're waking up from a bad hangover. Every massive blow you and the gang took during Chapter 3 feels like it didn't happen, but it did happen all at the same time in this weird blur. And it has you asking yourself, what the hell happened last night? Well, guess what? None of it matters, remember? It doesn't matter that Chris maybe has opened the bunker, or that Tenna could possibly be dead if depending on how many friends you made in the area. And it doesn't matter that Officer Undying is missing. But what does matter is that Chris and Susie are subjected to one of the worst parts of a Saturday night sleepover: Sunday morning church. So while at the church, we learn that the people of this town actually know the prophecy, and they kind of worship it as some sort of deity. And while at the church, you're actually tasked with going ahead and searching for clues about where this code to the bunker might be. One banging sermon later, along with some shenanigans and a really passive-aggressive interaction with your teacher, you end up finding out more clues about that bunker and how it's basically kind of like a shelter that's really never touched unless there's an emergency. But then Purple Jurassic Park over here surmises that Noelle probably has some clues at her house to the different codes. One Yuri interaction later, you end up setting up a study date between Susie and Noelle where you just kind of third wheel. There are a bunch of things that you could do in Hometown before going to this study date, however, but the one thing I do want to talk about is this interaction between Susie and Chris, which expands upon the second narrative pillar. When they spend time at the diner, it is just adorable, and you see them kind of just goofing off and getting to know each other just a little bit more. And it is also one of the first times in this chapter where we see Chris finally kind of opening up to us, the player, whether they are realizing it or not. Finally, we end up at Noelle's house, and there is so much stuff to learn. I mean, we're finally able to explore December's room, and we learn so many things about her and her personality through all these different context clues. And we also learn that her and Asriel, your brother in this game, are super close in some way because his retainer is in that box. But we learn so many things about December the person instead of all the different things surrounding her disappearance that this game has led up to thus far. And just when you're about to touch the guitar, which looks like one of the most prized possessions in this room, Chris decides that they're gonna open up to you yet again, and then close you right off by stuffing you in a closet inside of a box. Yeah. So in this moment, you actually get to explore the home and move around as just the heart in this really weird and surreal experience. Because for the first time in this game, you are truly on your own as the player. And the information that you can gather from just snooping around this house as the heart is so cool. You can listen to Noelle and Susie have their fun little date interaction. You also find Asgore in here and realize he's looking at some sort of conspiracy theory board and learn a bunch of context clues about why maybe December disappeared. And wait, why does he have a shadow crystal? But personally, one of my favorite parts of Noelle's house is when you listen to the phone call that Chris has with some eerie entity, and then you leave and then you come back, you actually can sit and listen to Chris play the piano. Something that we had heard from other characters in this game that they could do, but then you actually just sit and listen and you hear how beautiful it is. And it's in this weird moment of them finally being themselves again, and in a moment where they have a minute to breathe and we're not in control of them, and you almost feel guilty for being in the situation you are with Chris. One jump scare with a guitar and then a closet crash out after that, along with a bunch of Yuri happening in the background. You learn that the person on the phone was probably Carol. It's not explicitly stated, but regardless, Carol comes home and crashes out with everybody here except for you, Chris. And then, and then after that, everybody gets kicked out. I mean, this whole area is just a super deep dive into that second narrative pillar, where we just keep peeling back the layers of every character within this game, like Asgore and Noelle and Des, and Des hasn't even been seen yet, but still, we see all of it, and we learn just a little bit more about who might be creating these dark fountains and what the ultimate goal is in this world. But finally, we go to reunite back with Toriel, and then... So this chapter is actually kind of crazy long, and honestly, Noelle's house probably could have been a chapter in itself. But believe it or not, this is where this chapter's dark world begins, and it is finally just starting to get crazy. So Chris and Susie dive into the dark world, and you actually have an encounter with the knight off rip. But of course, they can only kick her ass in a cutscene, and to add insult to injury, you have this happen. And the aftermath of which is actually met with Ralsei rushing in to try and heal you, rather be it in a very tense fashion that almost disregards Susie entirely. Almost akin to somebody referring to Susie this entire video by calling them silly nugget purple names instead of actually their real name, you know? It could be weird, could be very disregarding and rude of somebody to do that. Regardless, we then start to proceed through an angelic-like setting within the church, throughout which we talk to these philosophical type characters, kind of regurgitating the prophecy in their own kind of spin on it, and we also see the prophecy spelled out for us on different glass panes. I mean, we had seen the summarized version of this so many times in the past, but now we have it finally being explicitly stated to us verbatim. Stuff like the regular hero's journey, like we've already heard, stuff about the toothpaste boy, and stuff about Jockington. And I told you he'd become important, damn it. He's gonna grow the beard. I just can't wait to see it in the next chapter, okay? But arguably, we do meet a more important character when we meet this guy named Gerson. This old man teases us and the entire party and teaches Susie lots of valuable lessons. And he shows her how to be more confident within herself. And eventually we come to a point where we find out Gerson is the secret boss of chapter 3 and gives us a massive monologue during his battle about freedom and how to define your own destiny. So not only do we have Gerson exemplifying that third narrative pillar of freedom, but we also have him directly contradicting the first narrative pillar that we saw at the beginning of the game. But it is this exact version of freedom that is so quintessential to Susie's character and her role within this story. I mean, in almost every single chapter thus far, we've seen Susie have so much more freedom and independence in her choices and have them being so much more consequential upon the story than anything that maybe we've done as a character. And we continue to build upon Susie's character development through the second narrative pillar once we close the fountain in this dark world. We learn more about her and her origin story in this town with all the different monsters when we interact with the piano within one of the offices in the church. And she tells us about how she wanted to play it and then people didn't want her to play it and she had to, not play it. It was one of the rules. And then she wanted to smash the piano. But Then Toriel reached out to her one day and gave her a safe space that she could be in. And it's just incredible to see so much depth from a character that seems so two-dimensional at the beginning of our story. And we begin to empathize with her even more when we go to the other office and she discovers that Gerson has actually unfortunately passed away. I mean, I can only imagine the kind of grief you feel when you meet a new friend and somebody that you just look up to and respect so much as a mentor, just to learn almost immediately that they have passed away and they are no longer a part of this world. I can only imagine how much it has warped her perception, and that perception actually matters a ton moving into the next piece of our chapter. Because when Susie opens a dark fountain, we see that the world is kind of warped and different, and it's not like the dark fountains that had been opened up in the past. And besides the fact that this world is kind of flipped upside down, and we see all the different dialogue from the people that were frozen in the previous part of the chapter, and the further expanding upon of the prophecy, we then understand that there's going to be a lot of things different about this world, and the Gerson of this area is really weird, and we can only presume that he is a zombie or warped in some way and capacity. And we can presume this because of the aforementioned grief that Susie is actively working through at this moment. All of that respect and all of that love and admiration that she had for Gerson was immediately turned on its head, and it was all reflected within Susie's dark world that she created into this zombie Gerson statue thing. And it is cool just to see how they play upon different narrative pillars within this game, all through subtext and stuff that isn't even explicitly stated. But as amazing as all the Susie stuff is, we have to talk about how weird and freakishly strong Ralsei is. I mean, why in this moment is Ralsei so incredibly strong? Basically, he one-shots this Gerson statue thing. And not only that, they do it through physically hitting and attacking this thing, which up until this point in the game, we've only seen Ralsei use magic. I mean, why do they have the ability to just one-punch man through one of the craziest, strongest characters we had seen in the game up until this point? Ralsei is hiding a lot, and it's making me ask a ton of questions and kind of frustrating me. And I'm not the only one that feels this way, because it all finally comes to a head and Susie and Ralsei go at it. We see Susie demand why Ralsei hasn't been telling us any information about all this stuff that's been happening thus far, not even just in this chapter, but in previous chapters as well. And she basically begs Ralsei to just be honest with everybody. And Ralsei, both overwhelmed by the situation and all of the information flooding to them at once, they just absolutely break down. And they don't know why they know all this information, but they do, and they don't know when to tell it, and they just say that they want to make sure that everybody's smiling and safe, and they don't want to scare anybody. And they also say that it hurts to know all this info. This is such a tough scene, but it's also something that I had kind of been itching for the past couple of chapters, especially after chapter 3. And even though it didn't answer a lot of the questions, we at least have a promise from Ralsei that they're going to be a bit more honest with us moving forward. With the stipulation, though, that they have to go ahead in the next room so that we don't see the end of the prophecy. This is probably one of the most impactful moments in the entire game thus far in playing on the second narrative pillar. It is a beautiful moment between characters where we really get to know, especially just Ralsei, and we get to know what's going on inside of their head finally. So after the crash out, the gang closes this dark fountain and actually opens the door to the fourth sanctuary, and almost immediately confronts the knight. But unfortunately for our gang, they have to fight a titan. And the titan is the Valve logo. But in all seriousness, we have an epic drawn-out fight like usual, and then finally Gerson, in his original form as they perceived him, makes a return, which kind of gets you thinking, okay, well, whose dark world is this, and why do they have such an awesome and positive perception of Gerson? But Gerson helps Susie break down the Titan and also inspire her to have an idea, where, in this get dunked on moment, you get inside of the Titan, and you see this amazing, beautiful scene between you and Susie. And one of my favorite things that happens after this scene is that Susie actually asks you, what is that red heart thing? Unfortunately, they don't really expand upon this, and she gets more worried about Gerson and goes looking for him. But Susie rushing away does not end well, because Ralsei realizes that they're going to see the final part of the prophecy. But just as Ralsei is going to confront Susie, they smash the final part of the prophecy, making it awfully convenient for we don't see it. This is then followed up with that third narrative pillar yet again in a defining moment where Susie says we're not going to let that happen, and saying not only they won't let it happen, but the rest of the gang will not let it happen, to the point in which she almost laughs off the whole thing. But after this, Ralsei breaks down and cries and says that no matter what we've been doing, that the prophecy is just continuing to play out exactly as foretold, kind of contradicting everything Susie just said, and again, further, bolstering that first narrative pillar. But in a weird moment of character growth, we see Ralsei heel turn on this idea, saying that through everybody's help, they want to try and change the prophecy as much as they can, if at all possible. I mean, it is just kind of beautiful that Ralsei's almost using the second narrative pillar of finding one's true self and opening up to Susie and Chris to kind of defy the first narrative pillar. And it's just so cool to see how all three of these things are connected, especially in this quintessential moment basically halfway through the game. And not only are they all connected, but they're almost at war with each other. And it makes for such an interesting and awesome experience within the narrative. It's just captured in this scene so well, and it just makes you hungry for so much more, especially because I didn't get to see the last damn panel of the prophecy. Deltarune has given us so many examples of its narrative themes that make up the structure of its wonderfully woven story. Its compelling interactions between different characters along with the complex world in which they exist, all while this continues to be at odds with the different narrative themes that they're trying to push onto you, the player, making for one of the best stories to ever grace the medium of video games. I can only speculate about where the next chapter of this amazing story is gonna go. I mean, it'll probably end up in Asgore's flower shop, as it was alluded to in the prophecy, or maybe something crazy is going to happen at the fair that they're talking about. Or maybe we will finally figure out who exactly the Roaring Knight is. Only time and Toby Fox will tell. I mean, we've seen all the amazing fan theories and the way that chapter 3 and 4 has impacted the community of Deltarune. I mean, between December being the night and all the different theories about, Asgore and where this actual narrative is going to be heading eventually, plus all the things from chapters 3 and 4 that I just didn't get to touch on here. There is just so much to unpack about this game and its community, especially with its fan theories. So if I missed mentioning anything, or you have any favorite theories of yours you would like me to summarize, go ahead and leave those in the comments down below. And while you're down there, go ahead and leave a like and a subscribe as well. Maybe if enough of you subscribe, I'll do a video kind of summarizing different fan theories between the different chapters of Deltarune. It could be a fun watch, But anyways, and as always, thank you all so much for watching.